Kia ora tātou, Tamariki, good morning and welcome. I spend a lot of my time in dimly lit rooms looking at rows of data, so it's a real pleasure to be able to be with you this morning and share some of our work. And I want to mihi to Abby and Sarah and James and Vasantha for making this happen and for inviting me to be with you today. So as Abby said, I'm going to be speaking a bit about a piece of work that we've done looking at using some data from the General Social Survey that's been linked to the IDI and trying to do an exploratory piece of work to understand how our government spending matches to people with different levels of disadvantage. So before I get into that, I have a bit of housekeeping. This is a disclaimer that I'm required by my agreement with Stats New Zealand to show you. You'll see it in Jason's presentation as well. Essentially says that this is not official statistics, that Stats New Zealand has endeavored to hide the identity of all the people that we look at, and that any mistakes in the analysis are entirely my own, and Stats cannot be held responsible. So they are off the hook. I should explain a bit. So I didn't say that I am the lead of the families stream of the Families and Whānau Wellbeing Research Program. And that is I wanted to tell you a bit about the history of that program. It was originally a creation of the Families Commission, which became Suparu in 2014 as a result of the change of its legislation. And then as Suparu prepares to be wound down at the end of this financial year, at the end of June, it has been moved to the Ministry of Social Development as of November last year. So that's to explain why you'll see Suparu logos on some of the slides. And one of the things that research program does is, since it became Suparu, we've published an annual report on the status of families and whānau in New Zealand. So here's some pictures of the covers that we've had over the years. You can see we finally coalesced on one color scheme. And the work that I'm going to be presenting is going to form part of a chapter that's coming out in this year's report at the end of June. So if I may shamelessly plug that report and just tell you a little bit about the chapters that are in it, I think you'll find that interesting. There's a family stream and a whānau stream. In the family stream, we have 3 chapters. For the first time, we've worked with Ministry of Health and Statistics New Zealand to apply family type to the New Zealand Health Survey. So we show some analysis from a family perspective on that data for the first time in our first chapter. Then we have a chapter that extends some of the work that we started on multiple disadvantage last year, and will be some of the content that I'll be presenting today. We have done a deep dive into looking at the well-being of sole parents, because they are disproportionately affected by disadvantage, in particular multiple disadvantage. And on the whānau side, we have another 3 chapters. The first is an overview of the history and circumstances of housing for whānau, dating from before the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi to the present day. We have a second chapter that explores the connection between housing quality and whānau well-being using data from the Te Kupenga survey. And the last chapter is looking at how the whānau rangatiratanga framework, which was developed by Suparu, can inform the evaluation of the A2 Whānau initiative at the Ministry of Social Development. So thanks for your patience there. I hope that you'll see some things that you'll be interested in reading at the end of June. And because this is a Suparu product and we're transitioning to being an MSD product thereafter, you will find it on the Suparu website at the end of June. So I hope you go and look at it then. Now, I've said that this presentation is about multiple disadvantage, so I should probably explain what I mean by that. Simply put, multiple disadvantage is the situation of facing a number of difficulties or challenges across several life areas all at the same time. So historically, we've had some idea about the population who are in poor health, or who are living in poor quality housing, or who are unemployed, but our interest is in understanding the co-occurrence or the overlap of these things. So who is sick and in a poor quality house and unemployed. And we're interested in that group of people because we know that the most vulnerable people in society are not those who have 1 or 2 difficulties, but have many. And if we think that trying to resolve a complex interplay of a number of different difficulties across many different areas of people's lives requires different kinds of services than for people who just have 1 or 2 issues, then it's important to understand what size of population is experiencing multiple disadvantage, what kinds of combinations of disadvantage do they face, does it vary for different groups, and so this is how we got into this topic. The way we began was to try to create a measure for multiple disadvantage in New Zealand because we don't have one. We haven't historically. And so we began with our family well-being framework, which, if you're interested in knowing more about that, is in previous status reports. So we looked at what we had there and also the literature on measuring multiple disadvantage. That got to us to a list of life domains and indicators for measuring multiple disadvantage, and we took that to a reference group composed of a number of representatives from different government agencies, I think 7 in total. And we also looked at the General Social Survey, which, if you don't know, is a survey that's been going on since 2008 every 2 years, and it looks at a number of different areas of people's lives, and is pretty much the best option that we have for this kind of work, because remember, we need to know about the same person in a number of the different areas of life. So the GSS is a great source of data for that. After doing a bit of testing, we've ultimately landed on a measure that we felt comfortable using. Now, the fancy diagram that I have in the report on this looked terrible in this presentation, so I've come up with another one, so I apologize it's not all that slick. But what we've done is we've looked at 8 different life domains, and that's what you see there in the purple. So income, material well-being, employment, education, health, housing, safety, and connectedness. We have identified some indicators that will help us identify whether those domains are in disadvantage or not. And if we see 3 or more of those purple boxes in disadvantage, we'll say that somebody is multiply disadvantaged. And clearly, if you have more of those domains in disadvantage, it's a more serious form of that. So, okay so far? Okay, thank you. We then used that measure and applied it to the General Social Survey, and I'll just give you a few of the high-level results. So first, we found that 18%, or a little more than 1 in 6 adults in New Zealand experience 3 or more life domains in disadvantage. And that if you flip that around and look at all of the incidences of disadvantage that we examined, about half occur with 2 or more other disadvantages, which is to say that half of all disadvantage comes in the form of multiple disadvantage. Yet another way of putting it is you could say that 18% of all adults bear about half of all the disadvantage in New Zealand. So those are some findings. We also looked at the prevalence of multiple disadvantage across family types. It ranges for sort of between 5 and 13% for many family types, but in the case of sole parents, it's half. So 50% of sole parents have 3 or more of their life domains in disadvantage, and much of that is a more extreme form, or 4 or more, which is why we did a whole chapter on sole parents this year. The other thing is that the type of disadvantages faced for people who are multiply disadvantaged in different family types, if you're still following me. So for younger people, younger couples without children, or those who do have children, housing and income and material well-being were some of the main ones if they had 3 or more, whereas older couples without children tended to have health, education, and income as the ones that were most prevalent if they had 3 or more domains in disadvantage. So if you want to know more about that, again, the Subaru website is a good place to go. It will continue after its disestablishment for a year, so you can find all of that work there. Okay, so this kind of explains all of the General Social Survey work and a bit of what we did on multiple disadvantage. So we were able to identify where we think people are experiencing difficulties or challenges in the life areas. We got very excited when we heard that the General Social Survey would be moved into and linked to the IDI, because the IDI is a collection of administrative data that has a lot in there, but one of the main things we were interested in is understanding how the provision of services kind of matched to people's needs and how well we were doing in that. And so we've kind of used a rough measure of the dollars that have been spent in delivering services to individuals in the 12 months following their taking the General Social Survey. So you're going to see some numbers. It relates to the respondents and what can be attributed to them in terms of government spending in the year after the survey. So what is in that? We've looked at 5 different areas of spending. So the first is income support. So this includes all of the Tier 1, 2, 3 benefits and ACC income support. We have pensions. They're such a big source of government spending that we've concluded them on their own. Public health care, this includes anything you might imagine, inpatient, outpatient, laboratory tests, pharmaceutical reimbursements, ACC, injury payments. And there's also mental health to a greater or lesser degree in there as well. Formal education, so this general social survey interviews people who are 15 plus, so there's not any ECE or early childhood education in there, but we do have industry training enrollments, tertiary education, and secondary education. And then some information about court and corrections costs, which don't really accrue to the person with the problem, but anyway, they're in there as well. So I've got 3 graphs that I think kind of highlight the results that we've found. So on the y-axis here are dollars. So this is the spend that people received in the 12 months after the survey by the number of domains in disadvantage. So the points here that you see are the average spend for different groups at different levels of disadvantage. So it ranges from about 3,000 for those who have 0 domains in disadvantage up to 15 or so for those with 5, 6, or 7. And you can see that the confidence intervals, which are these black bars, begin to overlap because they get to be quite small numbers. So we can't see a statistical difference once you get up to 5, but there are a couple features of this graph. You'll note that it's more or less linear, it's upward sloping. So that's good news. I think if we saw something different, that people with lots of disadvantages weren't receiving as much or equal to those with lower numbers, we might be concerned. So I think that's one finding. We also see that there's a bit of a jump between those with 4 and 5, that spending really kicks in at that point. So the next thing we did is we tried to decompose this line into the different spending areas that I presented earlier, just to see, like, in terms of those who have 0 domains in disadvantage, what proportion on average, if that is, say, pension spending versus income support. So remember this line? That's what it looks broken down. So you can see that the flatness of the slope earlier, in large part, is driven by the fact that for those who have 0, 1, or 2, about half of the government spending comes in the form of pensions. So it's a bit skewed. There's a lot of folks who will be receiving relatively little at that end, but because it's kind of a universal benefit for those of a certain age, you kind of see this. So I should point out that this blue line with the circles is the pension spend, and the darker blue line with the stars is income support. So we see that a lot of the shape of that line toward those who have many domains in disadvantage is driven by the change in income support. For the other 3 lines are more flat, although you do see an upward slope with the health spending. Because those are more population-driven spending, we don't see a lot of difference across those who have different levels of disadvantage in terms of the amount of spending they would receive on average. So we didn't interrogate these data much further, and I'll explain why in a moment, but the last thing that we did was to have a look at incidences where we saw people who had demonstrably high levels of disadvantage but didn't seem to be receiving a lot of government spending for one reason or another. This is trying to understand, like, who might be in need of government services but doesn't seem to be getting them. So I'll take you through column by column. I've been told this is a complicated table. So in thinking about multiple disadvantage, having 3 or more domains in disadvantage, what I've done is I've looked at the proportion who have different levels of spending. And I've picked 0 to 3,000 as a point of interest because the average for those who have 0 domains in disadvantage is $3,000. So I would categorize that as a relatively low level of spend. And we see that for those who have 3 or more domains in disadvantage, almost a third are receiving a low level of spend. If you look at a more extreme form of multiple disadvantage, 4 or more, the number decreases slightly, but about 1 in 4 people are receiving very low spend. And then at 5 or more, it's about 1 or 6. So that's a bit disturbing on the face of it, but I should very quickly say that there are a lot of reasons why we may have gotten this result that don't necessarily mean that those people are receiving nothing. The first is that when Stats New Zealand did the linking, they only linked the responses for the respondent of the General Social Survey and not the other members of their family or household. So because we deliver income support, especially to families and to many members of the family, we're not probably capturing all of the support that those people are receiving. So that's one source. They may also be receiving support from friends or family and have not gone to the government, or they may be receiving support from an NGO that's been funded by a block grant and is unable or doesn't have the data to be able to attribute the spending that they are doing for any particular individual, and that's why we failed to capture them. It may also be that we don't provide services for some of the disadvantages that they have. We provide relatively few housing support services compared to income support, for example. So, it's possible you have a combination of disadvantages that there's just not a lot of government programs for, and that's why you've ended up in my figures. However, it's hard for me to believe that 100% of these numbers are related to the data or to these other artifacts. So I think that this shows that there's some power in being able to identify folks who have needs but are not being addressed. And I think that what we'd hope to do with the future of this work, and I think this shows the power of that linked data. Often people discuss the pros and cons of administrative data versus survey data, but clearly they complement each other and are very powerful. And so we're hoping that this linked data continues to be a feature of our data ecosystem and improves over time. And we'd like to do a bit more work on that in the future. So that's where I'm going to leave you. But I think, just some final conclusions. Well, one, this is an exploratory piece of work, so we can only say what we can say. But I think there's some good news in that. We can see that those trends sort of show what we would hope or expect, that people with more disadvantages are receiving more support. And I think you can also see that there are clearly probably some people, and a non-trivial number, who are needing support but are not getting any. And we need to look into that further. And as I've said, I think that this linked data is a great place to be doing that. So I don't know where I'm on time, but I think I better hand it over. So thanks.